Hello and welcome to this presentation on licensing Microsoft Developer Tools, looking at the licensing of Visual Studio and MSDN subscriptions. My name is Vicky Lee and I'll be taking you through this presentation today. In this session we'll be looking at what Visual Studio actually is, the client and server products that make up Visual Studio, how MSDN subscriptions work and how they're licensed with Visual Studio, and then the licensing of the Visual Studio server products. Let's start off then with what Visual Studio actually is. Visual Studio is an integrated development environment for designing, developing and testing solutions. It's there to develop a variety of applications over different platforms, so you can develop applications for things such as Windows, Windows Mobile, the .NET Framework, SharePoint and Microsoft Silverlight. It comes with 4 key programming languages: Microsoft Visual Basic, Microsoft Visual C#, Visual F# and Visual C++. And it's aimed at 3 different sets of people: the developers who will actually be building the applications, the testers who are testing the applications and putting them through their paces, and the project managers who can lead the collaboration and scheduling the work to enable that development and testing to work properly. This is the initial screenshot that a developer would see, enabling them to create new projects or open up existing solutions. Once a new project has been created, the developer would select the language that they want to develop in, and then you can see from this screenshot that Visual Studio comes with a number of different templates there to assist in developing, for instance, applications for Office, SharePoint, Silverlight and so on. This is the actual development environment, and you can see it's split here in the top half of the screen to have an area where you could create dialog boxes. In the bottom half of the screen you have the area where you do your coding. There's properties over on the right hand, so really all the key components that one would expect when developing an application. Let us move on now to have a look at the products that make up Visual Studio, and we have split those products into both client applications and server products, and we'll be starting off with the client applications. There are a number of different client applications in the Visual Studio family. Visual Studio Professional is an application aimed really at individual developers so that they can create, debug and deploy solutions over a variety of platforms, including things like SharePoint and solutions for the cloud. Visual Studio Premium is aimed again at either an individual or a team of developers to enable them to deliver scalable, high quality solutions. Visual Studio Ultimate is really a very comprehensive suite of applications, and it is there again for teams of developers to work together and to enable them to have these high quality results all the way from the design process through to deployment. Visual Studio Test Professional is there for teams of testers to go through and sort of test the code, debug the code, and then enable them to collaborate back with the developers so that obviously any bug fixes can then be included. Visual Studio Team Explorer Everywhere is there to allow developers who have been developing from the Eclipse IDE to access Team Foundation Server, and we will talk about Team Foundation Server in a moment. And finally, Visual Studio Team Explorer is the client application to access Team Foundation Server. As it says here, it is a free download, but there is some licensing required to access the server, and again we will talk about that a little bit later on. There are 3 server products in the Visual Studio family. First of all, let's look at Visual Studio Team Foundation Server. Now, we've already mentioned that Team Explorer is the client application to Team Foundation Server, and the server provides a centralized sort of data repository for all of the information to do with the application that's been developed. So it allows you to store all of the design information to easily access content when building, testing and deploying the software. Visual Studio Lab Management is there to enable teams of testers to quickly provision virtual environments for them to test the code and make sure that everything is working properly. And finally, the Load Test Virtual User Pack enables you to simulate up to 1,000 users so that the testing is much more sort of real world testing, and you can see what happens when you have larger quantities of users working with that system. We've looked then at all of the products that make up the Visual Studio family, so now what we're going to do is move on to look at the MSDN subscriptions. The MSDN subscriptions could be thought of as the software assurance offering for the Visual Studio products. If you do have the MSDN subscription, that does give you the rights to the next release version of the Visual Studio client applications, but also gives you access to a whole host of benefits which will again enhance that sort of development environment. Now, MSDN subscriptions are generally purchased with the Visual Studio client products, but there are two editions that can be purchased standalone, and that is MSDN Embedded and the MSDN operating systems. However, today we are going to concentrate on purchasing the MSDN subscriptions along with the Visual Studio products. When Visual Studio Professional, Premium, Ultimate or Test Professional are purchased through an Open Select or Select Plus agreement, the end customer can decide whether they want to purchase those licenses with or without the MSDN subscription. And you will see here that those licenses do fall into the applications pool in those agreements. If they're purchased through the Open Value, Enterprise Agreement or Enterprise Subscription Agreement, they can only be licensed with an MSDN subscription. Visual Studio Team Explorer Everywhere is always licensed without MSDN, and Visual Studio Team Explorer, we've already mentioned, is a free download, but it is also included in the Visual Studio client applications. The benefits you get with your MSDN subscription do vary slightly depending on which edition of Visual Studio you've purchased. So you will see that for production use, and what we really mean here is, your kind of real life everyday use, you do get the rights to use the Windows Azure platform, and you get a number of hours worth of access to that. You get your licensing for Team Foundation Server and the CAL so that the users can access that. With the Ultimate Edition, you'll also see you get access to Team Explorer Everywhere. And with Premium and Ultimate, you do get the rights to install Office, and we will talk about that in a little bit more detail in a moment. You do also get access to some products for development and testing purposes only. So you're really getting access to here products that form part of the Windows Server system. So for instance, Windows 7, Windows Server, SQL Server. This isn't a full list of products, but it is some of the ones that you can use. But the limits here are that they can only be used for development and testing. They cannot be used on production servers. You'll also see here you get a number of technical support incidents, access to the online concierge and some of the e-learning collections. Now that we've looked at the products in Visual Studio and we've talked about the MSDN subscriptions, let's move on to how it's all licensed. The Visual Studio products are licensed per user, so every developer who is working with Visual Studio would need a license. This does mean that they can install the Visual Studio products on any number of computers. So that could be computers they're developing on at work, but if they were developing on computers at home as well, they would be licensed to put that software on their home computer. There are step-up licenses available if you've purchased Visual Studio with MSDN. So you would be able to step up, for instance, from Visual Studio Professional with MSDN to Visual Studio Premium with MSDN, or if you desired, all the way up to the Ultimate Edition. We saw earlier that if you had purchased Visual Studio Premium or Ultimate with MSDN, then you got the rights to install Microsoft Office Professional Plus. And I just want to clarify that that is the rights to install just one copy of Office Professional Plus on one device. And finally, if you have purchased either Visual Studio Ultimate with MSDN or Visual Studio Test Professional with MSDN, then you do get the rights to use the lab management functionality. Some extra points then to be aware of about the MSDN subscription. If you have purchased it through volume licensing, that subscription can be assigned to another user, but you are only allowed to do that every 90 days. So I suppose in the event of one developer leaving, a new one coming, you'd be able to transfer that subscription over. When a sort of system has been developed, that system often needs to be tested by the end users to see if they're happy with that system before it is actually deployed. And those end users would be accessing some of the MSDN software to do that testing. But that's absolutely fine. If they are just doing the user acceptance testing, there's no extra licensing requirements for those end users to access that MSDN software. And then finally, we mentioned that when you purchase your MSDN subscription, you do get the licenses to use certain software in development and test environments. And that software can run obviously in a physical or a virtual environment. That's absolutely fine. But just be aware of the fact if maybe you had one physical computer with two virtual machines, one of the virtual machines was running the MSDN software for the development and test environment. Obviously that's fine, that machine is licensed through your MSDN subscription. But the physical server and the other virtual machine, if they were both running sort of production software, they would need to be licensed in the usual manner, through the usual going and buying your Windows Server licenses and so on. Team Foundation Server is licensed using the normal Server CAL licensing model. So you would purchase a Team Foundation server license for whichever servers Team Foundation Server is running on, and you would purchase obviously user or device CALs for your users or devices to access the services of that server. If you do have users that are indirectly accessing Team Foundation Server, they do still need to be licensed with a CAL. It doesn't matter whether access is direct or indirect. If a user is accessing content that is held on Team Foundation Server and they're working with data held on there, then they do need to be licensed with a CAL. The same is true for external users. If you have non-employees of the organisation that are accessing your Team Foundation server, you would need to license them with a CAL as well. And one thing to bear in mind is that the CALs do relate to a specific organisation server. So imagine that external user was a developer who was also developing for another organisation, and for that other organisation had a Team Foundation server CAL. They would not be able to bring that CAL to this organisation's server. They would need to be covered with another CAL for this, company. There is an external connector license available as well, so if you do have a larger number of external users accessing that server, you could choose to license it with the external connector as opposed to buying individual CALs. Just as a reminder, if you do purchase Visual Studio Professional, Premium or Ultimate with your MSDN subscription, that does include the Team Foundation Server CAL, so you wouldn't have to buy a separate CAL at that point. And the final thing to think about is the fact that Team Foundation Server does need SQL Server running at the back end as well for that to work. I mentioned that Team Foundation Server requires SQL Server as its data repository, but rather nicely Team Foundation Server does include the rights to run SQL Server 2008 Standard Edition. However, it is restricted use rights with this, so that SQL Server must be deployed on the same server as the Team Foundation Server has been installed on, and it can only be there to support Team Foundation Server. You are not allowed to use it for any other product. So far I've talked about licensing Team Foundation Server when purchased through volume licensing, and that, as we've seen, is licensed just following the normal Server CAL licensing model. But the licensing for Team Foundation Server varies slightly when purchased through full package product. If you buy full package product Team Foundation Server, that gives you the rights obviously to install that on the server that you want to run the software on, and then it includes the rights for up to 5 named users to connect to that server without the need for CALs. So if you're buying through FPP, you can install on your server, you can have up to 5 users that you have named connecting to that server, and then that's the licensing done. Just as a quick recap with Team Explorer, we've already talked about the fact that it is the client application to allow you to access Team Foundation Server, and that it is a freely downloadable product, but is also included with the Visual Studio client applications. Now, as you can imagine, being freely downloadable, you can install it on as many devices as you require, but you do need to remember that a CAL is required to access the Team Foundation server. As we draw the presentation to a close, let's take a moment to think about what we've covered. We've looked at the Visual Studio family and we concentrated on the client applications and the server products that make up the family. We've had a look at the MSDN subscriptions, and then we've gone through the licensing aspects of licensing Visual Studio with the MSDN subscriptions and also licensing the Visual Studio server products. That concludes this presentation. I hope you've enjoyed listening to it, and I wish you the very best of luck when taking the associated assessment. Goodbye.